Good evening. My name is Amanda Jane Holland, and I am a social work student at VCU. And I will be talking about community organizing and the BLM movement. Community organizing is a method of engaging and empowering people with the purpose of increasing the influence of groups historically underrepresented in the policies and decision making that affect their lives. So, community organizing starts with relationship building and moves on to education, then building of community members, leadership development, community action, and then the cycle starts again once a new issue arises. Community organizing started through the work of Saul D. Alinsky. He started out as a criminologist and archaeologist, and then in 1938, he moved on to community organizing. He wrote the book on community organizing at its founding in the Rules for Radicals, a pragmatic primer for realistic radicals in 1971. His work through the Chicago-based Industrial Areas Foundation, helping poor communities organize to press demands upon landlords, politicians, and businesses, won him national recognition and notoriety. So he started out working on behalf of the working class. His goal was to create a guide for future community organizers to use in uniting low-income communities or have-nots in order for them to gain social, political, legal, and economic power. So Alinsky's methods were very different than what we see today as far as community organizing goes. His methods started with symbol construction, which basically held the community together through a common cause, but often his methods kind of held people together through a church or religious affiliation rather than just the idea itself, that was the focus for change. His tenets are very different than what the BLM movement uses. So I just want to talk about that a little bit. He believed that power is not only what you have, but that the enemy thinks you have. Power is derived from two main sources, money and people, and the have-nots must build power from flesh and blood. This is not necessarily the part that BLM kind of lives by. They don't believe that you must build power from flesh and blood. They try to be as nonviolent as possible. Never go outside of the expertise of your people. This is actually very good advice. You never want to stand behind a cause that you have no knowledge or expertise on, and you never want to speak on anything that you don't have any knowledge or expertise on either. Whenever possible, go outside of the expertise of the enemy. It's never a bad idea to be more educated on the principles that you're fighting for than the people you're fighting against. Make the enemy live up to its own rule books. Ridicule is a man's most potent weapon. This is definitely not a tactic that BLM uses at all. They don't believe in ridicule. A good tactic is one that your people enjoy. Finding new and creative ways to protest, for example, is one thing that BLM does very well. A tactic that drags on too long becomes a drag. I think we've seen a loss of momentum as of now in July 2020 versus when the movement really kind of picked up and got started in April and May of 2020. So partially the tactics may have dragged on a little bit too long in that sense. Keep the pressure on. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. In terms of the BLM movement, that's not necessarily true. The threat in this instance is police brutality. So there's the threat of being hit with rubber bullets and tear gas in protests. There's also the threat of being arrested or even sometimes killed. So in this case, the threat is either just as terrifying or more terrifying than the thing itself. The major premise for tactics is the development of operations that will maintain a constant pressure upon the oppression. If you push a negative hard enough and deep enough, it will break through into its counter side. The price of a successful attack is a constructive alternative. And that's definitely something we've seen with kind of like the social media movement of kind of cancel culture and trying to find like nonviolent ways to have a constructive alternative. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Cut off the support of the network and isolate the target from sympathy. Go after the people and not institutions. People hurt faster than institutions. This is definitely not something that BLM believes in. They are definitely wanting to go after things like institutional racism and systemic racism, and not that they're vehemently opposed to calling out specific people who uphold these ideals, but their real main target is systemic change. The Black Lives Matter movement was founded in 2013 by 3 women, Patrice Concolers, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, and it has a largely community-centered leadership model, which is referred to as participatory democracy. So direct democracy would be things like voting, participating in being in leadership roles, like say city council, for example. But participatory democracy is going to look more like a movement, like the civil rights movement or the Black Lives Matter movement. It's a decentralized movement. So this basically means that there are different BLM chapters all across the United States that are working on different things, but that they advocate for the same things, like nonviolent civil disobedience in protests against incidents of police brutality and all racially motivated violence against African American people. So the guiding principles of BLM are restorative justice, empathy, loving engagement, diversity, globalism. They are queer affirming, trans affirming. They have the collective value that Black Lives Matter, regardless of sexual identity, gender identity, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs, immigration status, or location. They are intergenerational. Their focus is on Black families, Black villages. They are unapologetically Black, and their focus is also on making Black women feel more safe and affirmed in their spaces. So some of the policy demands of the Black Lives Matter movement, in 2016, Black Lives Matter called for the decarceration in the United States. So decarceration refers to decarcerating specifically African American men and women. Black men and women are 3.5 times more likely to be racially profiled and even face stricter charges and longer sentences for crimes committed, the same crimes committed by Caucasian people. So that's what they mean when they are calling for decarceration. Reparations for slavery in the United States, an end to mass surveillance, investment in public education in place of incarceration, and community control over the police, empowering residents in communities of color to hire and fire police officers and issue subpoenas, decide disciplinary consequences, and exercise control over city funding of police. So for example, I live in Roanoke, Virginia at this time, and the city council just voted to cut funding for public education while also increasing funding for the local police department. So the Black Lives Matter movement believes that it shouldn't be just up to the city council to make these kinds of decisions. It should be a decision of the people as well, because many of us do not support the defunding of education and the higher funding of police. We would actually prefer it to be the opposite way. Some strategies and tactics that the Black Lives Matter movement uses, they use various social media platforms. They have embraced a diversity of tactics. Social media has been a source to advertise information on gatherings and protests as well as disruptions. So gatherings and protests are kind of what we see in the mass media as far as like the marches are concerned, but disruptions also refer to like the tearing down of statues, or if someone in power has been nominated, like Brett Kavanaugh, for example, to a position of power. A disruption would be like going to the unveiling ceremony or like the cutting ceremony and basically causing a disturbance. So there have been some results from the BLM movement. So for example, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti has vowed to pull $150 million from the LAPD to boost funding for healthcare, jobs, and peace centers. There have been several other mayors in different cities who have agreed to pull funding from police to fund things like education and healthcare as well. Our society can also rethink the way that it assesses crime. We can end enforcement of minor offenses that drive street level harassment. So, for example, when we think of things like loitering, which is literally just existing in a space that someone thinks you ought not to exist in, right? These types of crimes can certainly be repealed. Um, so other solutions include removal of the presence of police in schools, which exacerbates racial inequities, developing mobile crisis services, peer crisis services, and crisis hotlines and warm lines, banning pretextual stops and consent searches that act as common mechanisms for police to engage in racial profiling and circumvent legal standards, and implementing common sense civility and criminally enforceable legal constraints, so there will be only rare instances in which officers are able to use force against community members. Additionally, BLM believes there should be a strict consequence for law enforcement officers who commit acts of police brutality that not only include the loss of employment, but also criminal charges. So essentially, police right now are kind of exempt from consequences when they engage in things like police brutality. So there should be not only the loss of employment, and oftentimes with benefits, like when police lose their jobs, often it's a severance package that they're awarded, or they get leave with pay, right? But not only should it be termination of job, you should not be able to be rehired at a different precinct, which does happen, by the way. When officers lose their jobs, they can go to another precinct, but they should also have criminal charges. And this is something that the BLM movement is working very hard toward. They're definitely very grassroots, organized movement, and they're doing great things in a lot of major cities. These are the references that I used, and that is my presentation. Thank you.